Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to this latest In Conversation With event at Stern. My name is Mervyn King and my guest this evening is quite simply the most successful non-fiction author in the world, Michael Lewis. Of his 13 titles, from Liar's Poker to Flash Boys, from Moneyball to The Big Short, every single one has been a bestseller. His latest book, The Undoing Project, is published this week. Please give a warm welcome to Michael Lewis.
Thank you, Mervyn. Is this on? We're good?
Sure.
All right.
Splendid. Now, Michael, this
was pointed out to me? It was subliminal?
it's
All right. Okay.
this is the way you try to achieve superiority in the interview context. So, most of your books have been about slightly odd people, unusual, quirky people, who've defied the conventional wisdom. This time you've written about two college professors. Why have you written about two college academics?
So the books never start with, I want to write a book about this or that. What happened was this. I crawfished into this story over a period of years. A book I wrote called Moneyball came out in 2003. That book was ostensibly about baseball, but what it was really about, in my mind, was the way markets can misjudge, misvalue people. And this team, the Oakland A's, had figured that out. And because they lacked resources, they found new and better ways to value the players than existed. And it meant what they were doing basically was replacing the intuitive judgment of the so-called experts with analysis of the performance statistics that was just better. It identified systematic mistakes that the experts made in valuing the players.
Using business school research.
Exactly. A business school, actually, research. The research they were using it wasn't as if they had proprietary information. You could have gotten the stuff off the web, but nobody paid any attention to it because they trusted their experts. Nobody really believed that the experts didn't know. So this book comes out, and an economist and a lawyer together reviewed the book in the New Republic. Richard Thaler, who's a well-known economist, and Cass Sunstein. And they said in this review, it was they liked my book and so on and so forth, but I seemed not to know that there were these two Israeli psychologists who had explained why the experts got it wrong. They had done these two Israeli psychologists, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, had done work showing the systematic biases the mind was prone to when it was making intuitive judgments. And I'd never heard of them. I mean, so we got to clear the air here for a second. Mervyn was my tutor at the London School of Economics when I was a graduate student. And he's partly responsible for me not ever having heard of Danny and Amos as a result. I was not the most distinguished student, but in any case...
I didn't want to burden you with too much.
No, but so anyway, so we have a long history, and later on, if you want to get into it, I'm happy to get into it. But I'd never heard of these guys, and I thought. I filed it away. I went and actually looked them up on the web, saw that Danny Kahneman had won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he was a psychologist, in 2002, and then thought that's interesting. I have a drinking buddy in Berkeley. So this is how books come about. My drinking buddy is a psychologist named Dacher Keltner, very well-known psychologist. His field is emotion, but he was Amos Tversky's teaching assistant. And he was friends with Danny Kahneman. And then one night over drinks, I said, it's always bothering me, this was now about 2005, that I didn't get the story. That I told the story about this baseball game, and I never got to why the experts were making the mistakes. And he said, well, Danny has a house up the hill, and I have his email, I'll hook you up. And I said, this was back, I must have thought in 2005 that Nobel Prize winners in economics were unapproachable, as opposed to self-publicizing. And so I was kind of tentative about it, but I called him up, and he said, come on up and have coffee. And we started a friendship. We'd go for long walks in the Berkeley Hills, and the friendship at that point, this is a longer answer than you want, but this is the answer, was based on me helping him sort through the crisis of confidence he was experiencing, writing his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which has sold, I don't know how many millions of copies now, but which he was sure the moment it was published would destroy his reputation. It was wonderful. He was this welter of self-doubt, I mean, like I had never seen. And he was in the process, when I met him, of paying people, friends, to go and find people to pay who he would not see. So they'd be blind reviewers, to write him anonymous reviews persuading him not to publish his book because it would ruin his reputation. I mean, it was crazy. And so my job was go up every 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and say, it's great, do it. And in the course of this conversation, I just was interested in him. He started talking about this relationship he had with Amos Tversky. And it was love. It was a love story. It was the most amazing love story. It wasn't sexual, but it didn't, for these guys, as I've said, people who've asked for the one-line movie summary of this book, it's Brokeback Mountain, but they screw each other's ideas. And that's what it felt like. I felt like I was listening to the guys in Brokeback Mountain talk about each other. And at some point I thought, the emotion of this thing is really interesting, and that it had an arc of a love story with a breakup and all that. And the ideas are really interesting to me. And at some point, also it occurred to me that I had taught my one term at Cal, I taught a writing course. My favorite student was a kid named Orrin Tversky. And he turns out to be Amos Tversky's oldest son. And very quickly, when I said, you know, I might want to explore this as a story, I got in touch with Orrin, I said it to Danny. They opened it up to me, more or less. Danny was a little dubious about the whole thing, but the Tversky family opened the doors to Amos's files, and I started beavering away on this when kind of 2008, 2009, and I've been doing it ever since, and finally worked up the nerve a couple of years ago to write it.
At what point did you decide that this was going to be a book?
Only a few years ago. I mean, I worked and worked and worked on it, and they got sick of me being very Danny Kahneman-esque, going back and forth about whether my problem was, I had a couple of big problems. One was, I didn't know I could pull it off. I didn't know, I was a stranger to their field. I had never had as much as an introductory psychology course, and I was going to have to get my mind around their position in the field. And I was a goy writing about the early Israeli state. And I thought, do I have any business doing that? And I can imagine a million people telling me exactly how I got it wrong after I published it. So I was reluctant. I made 5 trips to Israel. I made 4 trips to Israel more than 10 days each before I committed to do the book. That's how much kind of legwork I did before I even thought, yeah, I can do the book. But it was 3 years ago or so, I finally said, I'm doing it. And what I concluded was, their story was so interesting, enough people thought it was important that someone was going to do it. And it was interesting enough that it justified doing it. And I thought that anybody who's going to do this is not going to have the access to the material that I've had already. Open access to the Tversky family and his files, Danny being forthcoming with me in a way he's never with anybody else. And so someone's going to do it, and they're probably going to do it badly. And what I said to Danny, who went back and forth about whether I should do this or not, I said, look, someone's going to write a book about you maybe after you're gone. It's probably going to be bad, and you're not going to like it. So if someone's going to write a bad book, it might as well be me, right? And you know me, you like me, it may be bad, but it might as well be me. Why not me if I'm going to write the bad book? And he said, that's probably right. He said, all of that's probably right. It's probably going to be a bad book, and so on and so forth. So it came about very hesitantly. It was unlike any of the other books I've done. Most of the other books, I've spotted the subject, and in 3 or 4 months, I'm in it, and at least as a magazine article. Yeah. And that's not the way this worked.
So in the end, how did you, I mean, Danny presumably was going to and forth about whether this was a good idea, and your relationship with him evolved. How in the end did you persuade him that he should really go along with it? Just as you said that? Just
as I said, he would say that I knew, so when Danny is the human embodiment of doubt, and his whole life, there's nothing stable. And he has an idea, he becomes wedded to it for a few hours, and then he turns on it. he lives his life that way, almost resisting commitment to anything. And I think it's partly because he doesn't like to defend things. But he would put it as, I like to change my mind. This makes it very difficult for people who are collaborating with him.
Yes.
And the stories are legendary about the paper is about to go to the publication. He says, we've got to pull it. It's going to ruin our reputations. And Amos, he used to do this with Amos. And Amos would sit with a drink in his hand with friends saying, let's wait for the call. And the call would come and he'd talk him down and the paper would go in. And I thought, I'm going to have a problem, because if I get in the middle of this and he changes his mind, it's going to be a lot of wasted effort. So the fallback position was always, the question isn't a book is going to be written or not going to be written. Someone's going to write the book. So it's not going to get better. You know I'm at least fond of you. I think that was the selling point. He was never happy with the idea. He never was really excited that I was writing a book about him. And when he got it, he was really not excited. And read it. I mean, all of the subjects of all of my books have had this jolt when they've read it. And I tell them all, that jolt you're going to feel even if I got it exactly right. Remember the first time you heard your voice on tape. It didn't sound like you. You're going to have that feeling a little bit. And it doesn't mean I got it right, but at least ask the people who know and love you whether I got it right before you get really angry at me. And so we've gone through that process where he thought, oh, this isn't quite right. And then they said, yep, it is right. And you kind of come to terms with it.
Before tonight, I spoke to one academic who'll be nameless who had done joint work with Danny. And he said, Danny is the most difficult person I have ever had to deal with. So what was Amos's secret to create this extraordinary creative partnership where you describe in the book how they would just sit day after day in a room, there'd be no one else in the room, people would hear them outside talking and laughing, and then suddenly these great thoughts and ideas would come out. How did Amos manage to pull off working with Danny?
It was painful and difficult, I think, sometimes, because nothing was stable. But I think so Amos Tversky is one of the most interesting characters I've ever encountered. And it was difficult at first thinking how I was going to bring this guy back to life. But he sends such a vivid signal.
He died in
96 of cancer at age 59. Yeah. But he sends such vivid signals even from the grave, because he never did anything he didn't want to do, anything, or never saved a piece of paper he didn't want to save. So there's no noise. It's all, everything you get from him, everything he saved in his filing cabinet, any friend he had, any party he went to, he was there because he wanted to be there. And that included his relationship with Danny, as difficult as it was. So he wants to be in it because he senses quite rightly that this is a very, very fertile mind who's generating ideas that just no one else will have. And it's just the grist for their mill was, I think, Danny's just idea-generating machine. How he made the relationship work, well, first, there aren't many people in the history of Danny in whom Danny has unconditional faith or trust in their minds. Even Danny was awed by Amos's mind. That everybody said that there was a famous Dick Nisbett, the Michigan psychologist, designed the one-line intelligence test, and it was about Amos Tversky. He said, the longer it takes you to figure out after you've met Amos that he's smarter than you, the stupider you are. And everybody who knew Amos felt that way. And Danny was aware that this was just this very powerful logician, is what he was. And so he gave Danny a sense of security. It wasn't. I think Danny thought Danny's always worried something's wrong with this. That if Amos approved of it, it must be right. I think that was part of the dynamic. And so Amos settled him down that way. And Amos was also supremely confident. So he made Danny feel confident. And Amos, for a stretch anyway, up until they basically get to this country, I think, treated all of his ideas kind of uncritically. There was a kind of unconditional love. And Danny responded very well to that. So there was a magic in that. I think that Danny, the taming of Danny for 10 years is one of the miracles of the relationship, and the ability to kind of keep him from flipping on them, on the ideas. Anyway, so Amos spent, when I was going through Amos's files cabinets, there are all these, there are breakup letters with Danny in them. There's this drama in the file cabinets, and among the signs of the drama, when there were a stack of papers that were clearly, actually some of them were marked, preparation for phone call with Danny, and it would be bullet points of all the things Danny was going to be upset about, and Amos's response, the arguments he was going to make in response. And this clearly happened over and over and over. And so he spent a lot of time. And now Amos, as I say, did not, in an extreme way, did nothing he didn't want to do. He would take his wife to the movies, and if he didn't like the movie after 5 minutes, he'd leave her, go home and watch Hill Street Blues, and go back and get her at the end of the movie. He'd say, they already took my money, they're not getting my time. And he told people, you should never stay in a board meeting or a faculty meeting or even a party if you don't want to be there, and you don't have to think of an excuse. He says, if you just get up and walk, it's amazing how the mind comes up with the words to explain why you're leaving. And he was just unbelievably efficient with in a really kind of in a preternatural way, and yet he was willing to endure this relationship. And I thought that was a powerful statement about what he thought of Danny.
There's lots of practical advice in the words of Amos, not in Danny. There's no practical advice from Danny, but Amos, yes. So Amos says at one point, he said, if you want to do research, it's a good idea to be in a permanent state of underemployment. It is better to waste hours than to end up wasting years.
Yes, this is very good advice.
And so giving yourself time to think. Don't rush around being busy. I can't tell you how many people I've met who were terribly busy and thought they must be very important as a result.
Yeah.
But it doesn't follow.
It doesn't
Having
follow.
the ideas is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
Can we turn for a minute to some of their ideas
Sure.
and their work? So what you describe in the book is a process in which they start working, first of all, on how people behave, how they make judgments. And what these people do is to say, well, economics has become a very deductive discipline. You make certain assumptions at the beginning, which no one really understands, but they sound very, plausible. And then you make lots of deductions about what constitutes rational behavior. And what they do is to do lots of experiments which show that actually people don't behave like that. And it takes a long time to persuade economists that maybe people don't behave in the way that economists normally assume. So they study these biases, behavioral biases that you describe in the book. And then they move on to say, well, now we've identified some of the biases. Let's ask a different question, which is how do people make decisions? So they make judgments, and they may get these things wrong. They don't understand probabilities, but how do they make decisions? And what intrigued me about it was that both in the words a few times of Amos, but particularly when you describe what their work means to us thinking about real world situations, you bring in the idea of people telling stories. So it's not just based on mathematics, it's people telling stories. And in fact, there is a quote on page 250 where you actually quote Danny on this occasion saying, no one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. So how far do you think economics or social sciences should move away from the more rigorous mathematical views and the use of numbers towards encouraging us all to tell a story?
I was afraid you were going to ask me a question like this. I'm back as your student, and I'm about to get a C.
Tell a story.
Because I don't have much should, in me. I don't.
No.
One of the things that's interesting about their work and the way it found its way into economics is it clearly wasn't intentional in the beginning. That they didn't think they were addressing economics. That they thought they were addressing decision theory, which was a weird branch of psychology, which happened to share with economics some assumptions about human behavior, that man was a good intuitive statistician or whatever. There was some overlap there. But it's only kind of midway through their relationship that Amos wakes up in a big way to the implications for economics. And Danny is the slowest of all. I mean, even now he claims never did he intend to influence economics, and they gave him a Nobel Prize for it. I don't think Amos would have said that that the assumptions that economists make are useless. They serve the purpose of the models, and the models they're tools. These are tools. I think Amos would have said that maybe it's going to get even more interesting. It would be even more interesting to try to adapt the models to actual human behavior rather than this theoretical economic man you dreamed up. But he was aware that it created horrible problems for economics, and that he was vastly increasing the workload for economists. And he was very sympathetic to economists who said, this is just too much trouble for us. Now, and economics does do a lot that's very useful. I mean, the course of study I pursued at the London School of Economics has been, there are a whole lot of ideas that I took on board that have been very useful ideas, and these were ideas that were all generated by people who were assuming rationality in man. So I don't think the lesson from Danny and Amos is you chuck out economics and you find a storytelling approach. In that quote, the passage you just quoted, what Danny was saying is he'd gone to, I think that's when he goes to the Israeli foreign minister and shows him, the best probability estimates of what will happen, how Arab countries will respond if the Israelis do walk away from a peace negotiation, and the estimate is like 10% increase in the probability of war, and the foreign minister says, 10% is nothing, and the number didn't mean anything to him. That's where they walk away from this field called decision analysis, which was stillborn basically, and it was stillborn. They decided because people in positions of importance, they don't want the power being taken away from them by an algorithm or by probability estimates, and they do want to think in stories. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, except that my takeaway from my experience with them is not that economics is in need of serious reform. That it isn't that at all. Right. Anyway.
So,
B minus?
No. We're going to reflect on it.
I tried. I bullshitted my way through like a good Princeton student.
A good Princeton student. So do you think Danny's now at Princeton? He's
emeritus. He's blocks from here is where he lives.
So did winning the Nobel Prize, do you think, change his views about economics or his own research or indeed his own life?
It transformed him. It's one of the things I was told by all the Israelis who knew him is that one of my problems as a writer was going to be the person I met was unrecognizable to the person they knew back then. That he was far less gloomy and troubled, and there was almost not exactly a sunniness about him, but he was just easier with the world around him. And that for some reason the Nobel Prize had you don't think of it changing a person's kind of basic demeanor, but apparently it had. I don't think. So it changed his relationship to the world. Mm-hmm. Other than that, that was the big effect it had.
So it removed some of the self-doubt that he had.
Yeah, let me tell you a story. I'm gonna ruin the book for you a bit, but in the interest of this moment, so one of the things that ripped apart the relationship was that the minute they came to North America, Amos was recognized as a global academic superstar, and Danny wasn't given the time of day. Amos gets the fastest appointment, I'm told, by Stanford ever made in the history of Stanford. They find out he's available in the morning, and they're offering him lifetime employment by the afternoon. And Danny isn't offered a job by anybody except University of British Columbia. Amos gets almost instantly a MacArthur Genius Prize alone for the work they did together. I mean, it goes on and on. Amos lived in fear he was going to get the Nobel Prize alone. I mean, he got the Nobel Prize. I interviewed someone who was with him. I mean, the MacArthur Prize, he was in Israel when it was notified. The person who was with him said he was livid. He said, how could they do this? We're going to rip the relationship apart. So Danny was already full of self-doubt. and the world is telling him that Amos is the genius. And Amos didn't do quite enough to address the problem, and that starts to tear at the relationship. Anyway, Amos dies in 1996. And the Nobel Prize is not given to the dead. You have to be alive to get it. And the work is seemingly regarded as sufficiently important that the Nobel Committee is considering giving it to Danny, the prize. And in 2001, he gets a call saying they want you to come give a talk in Stockholm. And Danny interprets this as they think the work is important enough for the prize, but they don't believe I had anything to do with it. It was an audition for me to show them that I was worthy of the prize. Which, whether it's true or not, this is what's going on in his head. And so he goes and gives a talk that has nothing to do with their work to show that his own work is worthy, that he was the kind of person who might have contributed to this work. So this is how full of self-doubt he is. The day the prize is announced, he and his wife are waiting by the phone in Princeton, New Jersey, because they think this may be it. And the phone doesn't ring. And he tells me the story that his whole life, his imagination has been, his fantasy life has been so vivid that he's careful about what he fantasizes about, because when he fantasizes about it, it's as if he's experienced it. And that this began when he was a child in the Holocaust, hiding from Nazis in chicken coops and barns with his mom and dad in the south of France. And that he had fantasies about single-handedly defeating the German army, and as a kid, and through adult life, that he had these very vivid fantasies. And they were so vivid, he said he found that when he fantasized about something he wanted, it actually reduced his motivation to go get it, because it was as if he already had it. And he wanted the Nobel Prize so badly that he didn't allow himself to fantasize about it. And so he's sitting there waiting for this call about this thing he's not allowed himself to imagine himself getting because maybe he's not worthy. And the phone doesn't ring. And his wife gets up and says, it's not going to happen. That's too bad. She's English, so she keeps it brief. And she goes off to go exercise. And he allows himself to fantasize about what he would have done had he won the Nobel Prize. And what he would have done was all the things for Amos that Amos would never do for him. That he would give his talk at the Nobel Prize with a giant photograph of Amos behind him. He'd bring Amos's wife and children with him. He would talk about Amos. He would append the eulogy he gave at Amos's funeral to his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. He would give Amos all the credit in the way Amos never gave him all the credit. And he's sitting there allowing himself to fantasize about it, and the phone rings. That's the end of the book.
It is. It's wonderful. Now, many authors write one successful book. Very few manage a second, third, fourth, let alone 13. What is the secret? What have you found to be the secret of writing consistently books that people really enjoy reading?
A kind of exquisite God-given talent, which nobody could actually emulate or hope to aspire to. So there's no point in really even talking about it.
It certainly fits the facts.
So
it's observationally equivalent to reality.
My career is full of serendipity. It's incredibly lucky that I end up at Salomon Brothers in the middle of the 80s boom with that kind of material at hand as a naive kid who kind of wants to be a writer. And I started out very lucky, and the luck has compounded. The luck in the beginning has given me access to stories I never would have had access to. The reason the Oakland A's are willing to talk to me is they read Liar's Poker. Right. The reason Danny's willing to talk to me is I got all these other books I've written that he's thought something of.
So how do you decide what to write about?
It's what I care a lot about. I have to care so much about it. If I care a lot about it, I have to feel, there is always a feeling before a book, and that before I decide it's a book, and I have to have the feeling, and the feeling is, this isn't about me, it's about the material, and I've been entrusted with it, and I have an obligation to tell the story well. Don't screw it up. So that's the feeling with which I need to go in, because it's miserable doing the book. And so I have to be able to go back to that. You have a responsibility to tell the story. Now, the general gift of gab and ability to put sentences on the page and all that, I mean, that's developed over time. Until I met you as a graduate student, maybe 6 months or a year before, I didn't have any ambition to be a writer. It was really when I got out of college it occurred to me. I didn't write for school newspapers, and no English teacher ever thought I was a gifted writer. I got a D in English my sophomore year in high school. There are many, many former teachers of mine who view my career as the way people view Donald Trump being president. It's like something's wrong in the world if he's in that stage. I wrote a book, The Blind Side, about this family in Memphis, Tennessee. So you probably saw the movie anyway, if you didn't read the book. And the main character in that movie, the father of the family, the character his name's Sean Toohey, that Tim McGraw played. When he was my student, was my classmate for 13 years at the Isidore Newman School in New Orleans, Louisiana, kindergarten through 12th grade. And as he said, the only prize you and I got when we got out was the prize for being there for 13 years, and that was absolutely true. And when I saw him, in the encounter that led me to find the story of The Blind Side, his first question to me was, "Who writes your books?" And I said, "I do." And he says, "That's bullshit." He says, "You're the dumbass in the back of the class with me. There's no way you wrote come on, just tell me who wrote." He honestly could not get his mind around the possibility that I had put pen to paper or sat at a computer and generated words that were this coherent. And so there's there's an accidental quality to this career, and it has had this compounding effect that it gets easier and easier in a weird way to get access to the things you need to write the good story.
Right. Now, in all your books, there's quite a large biographical element. People loom large. There's always, what's unusual is that there's always a serious story, plot line as well, but it's also people, this merging of the two. But you've never really written a book about conventional, successful people. The great hero. You haven't written a book about Napoleon or...
Oh, that's true.
So why have you steered away from that subject matter and homed in on people that none of us, before we opened the book, would ever imagine wanting to read about?
Well, there's no need for that story. It just comes back to the sense of obligation, that that there are going to be 100 books about Donald Trump, or about, the closest I did a little piece about Obama. That was the closest I got.
It was a magazine.
It was a magazine piece.
Yeah.
So that, I think that's the big thing, is who needs me for that? There are lots of people who can do those things. That finding the meaningful story no one realizes is meaningful is the trick for me, and seeing the meaning in it and waking the world up to it is my role. So if everybody's already awake to the importance of it, it's just hard for me to get excited about it. It's not to say it would never happen, but it's funny, when my career started, I have a friend who was 7 or 8 years ahead of me at the Isidore Newman School named Walter Isaacson, who is the head of the Aspen Institute now and former editor of Time Magazine, has written biographies of Steve Jobs and Henry Kissinger and Einstein and Ben Franklin and so on and so forth. So Walter Isaacson, who's wonderful, he's a wonderful writer, when I was a child, he was the most successful person anybody knew. He went to Harvard, and he was a Rhodes Scholar. Everything went right. Every 2 years, the headmaster brought him into the Newman School to tell us what we should be when we grew up. And by our about 10th grade, we were sticking our fingers down our throat when he walked in. And so I had all this. The first piece of advice Walter Isaacson gave me after I wrote Liar's Poker was, now you need to write your book about a great man. And I thought, no. Right. That's not what I'm going to do. That's what you do. Yes. And I've just never felt it. It never felt the slightest inclination to do it. The idea bores me. So that's not a good start for a literary project, to be bored by the idea.
There's obviously a lot of serendipity in as you said earlier, but you can't be purely passive. You must go out and look for interesting stories. You don't,
Yes.
you don't sit at home and they come like manna from heaven. How do you go about looking for stories, and what is it that when you see a story triggers something in your mind that says, I need to find out more about this. This could be an interesting story.
It usually is a really simple question. I mean, with this, is how did I miss that? I mean, I was right. How did I not think about what was going on in the minds of these people who were making these systematic misjudgments? I mean, it's an obvious question, and I didn't ask it. So this was an oversight on my part. But I mean, I'll just go one by one. With Moneyball, it was, there's this baseball team that's got a fifth the resources of the New York Yankees, is winning as many games as the New York Yankees. If this market is efficient, how on earth are they doing that? And I didn't think it was a book. I thought maybe it was a magazine piece, and I went and asked them a question, and the answer was just breathtakingly interesting. And so it usually starts with some curiosity like that. And it leads me into a place. And then the interest mushrooms. And it mushrooms. It has to, for it to be a book, it has to mushroom in very specific ways. I have to find characters that I find have literary dimensions to them, and in situations that are really compelling. And they have to be willing to let me hang around. So there's no system to it. I'm not scouring the newspapers looking for what the next book is. I don't know what the next book is right now, and I almost never do. And I'm as likely to get it from a dinner party, a beginning of an idea from a dinner party,
right,
as I am from or a conversation with a friend, or as from anywhere else. It's not a systematic process. It's a haphazard process.
So it really is serendipity.
It is. I'm waiting. So the way I feel when I'm looking for I never really look for book subjects. They kind of find me one way or the other. But I tell my kids, I've got my kids are 17, 14, and 9, and they're very intelligent. And even so, I have persuaded them that I have a gift for finding parking spots in the very hard to park Bay Area. And I'll say, we'll go to a restaurant. I'll say, it's not going to be a problem. There's going to be a parking spot right there. Now, it's 1 out of 10 times there's one there, but it happens often enough that they think, oh, he actually has a talent for finding a parking spot. And
this is the parking lot bias.
Yes, that's right.
That Kahneman-Tversky failed to spot.
So my gift for finding stories is a similar sort of thing. It's like I'm kind of wandering around, and I kind of half believe myself I have the gift for finding stories, and every now and then one opens up.
Fantastic. Well, let's open the conversation up now to our audience who would like to ask questions. There are roving microphones. There's one over there straight over there, gentleman in the light bluish shirt. One here. Just put your hand up again, sir, and then that's it. The microphone will come to you. And then there are others on this side who would like, yes, one there. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for coming. I'm very curious. So Danny Kahneman doesn't seem like the kind of guy who just opens up to anyone. So, and you were somehow able to build this very trusting relationship with him, and he trusted you to give you all this information. I'm curious on how you were able to do that, and maybe you can start like with how was the first meeting you had with him, and what did you really do to try to get him to open up to you?
I didn't do it consciously in the beginning because I didn't think I was going to be writing about it. I just was going to go see him and talk about like the relationship between his work and this book I had written. I walk in his front door the first time. He's in purple Crocs, and he looks like in an Israeli shirt, and he's kind of like very casual. And I said, I think I said something like, "I'm honored to meet you." And he looked at me strangely. He said, "Oh, you mean the Nobel Prize? Don't worry about that. That's dumb. Don't. And you don't stand on it." And he was he made the interaction very easy right away. But he was agonizing over this book. And we quickly were talking about his book. And he was giving me stuff to read, and I'd say what I thought about it and all the rest, and advise him on how to deal with his publisher and whatever it was that we were talking about. We had a natural subject of conversation. He, for his exercise, this was 2008, he was then 76. He would basically race walk through the hills of Berkeley. He would time himself. Ever since he was a little kid, he would time himself on walks around his gardens and try to beat his own time. He's not an athlete, but he's very competitive. And so I'd go on these race walks with him, and he started saying things so interesting that I'd bring a notepad. And I'd say, I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but can I just write stuff down? And I'd be walking around, and that was the next stage. And then finally, I said, there may be a story in this. You okay with that? And he was, I don't even know if he ever said yes, but he never said no. And he never rigorously went through his life story with me. Everything I got a nugget here, a nugget there, and his memory would be triggered by things. So I was gathering stuff in a very unsystematic way from him over 8 years, and it couldn't have happened fast. If it had been a more straightforward reporter-subject relationship, it would have lasted 5 minutes, and he'd had no interest in it. The great trick, though, to getting people who are interesting to cooperate with you on this kind of project or anything is to be interesting to them and useful. So I do this with all subjects. I'm not doing it, I just do it kind of naturally. It's not a ploy, but if you can somehow be helpful to them and fun to be around, it's amazing how much easier it is to be around them. With the Oakland A's, and to keep it in Moneyball, I would report what was going on in the clubhouse to the front office, and I would tell the players what was going on in the front office, and they always wanted to see me because they wouldn't talk to each other. And Danny became riveted in what was coming out of Amos's file cabinets. He had these love letters they had written to each other. He hadn't seen those he didn't have anything. All of his papers had burned up in the Oakland fire of 1989. So he had it was just triggering memory after memory. I was having him relive this relationship, and he was interested in that.
Question back there, in the middle somewhere? No, there was one down here.
How would the book Thinking Fast and Slow have been different if Amos was still alive?
Danny says it wouldn't have been written because Amos would have disapproved of it. This whole two-system thing, these little homunculi in your mind that Amos would have said that's a metaphor, and Amos didn't like metaphors. Amos thought metaphors were tools for deception, and so I think that whether Danny would have listened to him or not, I don't know. If Amos were alive, a lot of other things might have happened. Presumably they would have gotten the Nobel Prize together. They might. So here's the answer to the question. Actually, they from the very beginning had this sense that their work should be popularized, that there was a broader audience outside of just narrow psychology journals for this stuff, and they went back and forth forever on this project. Even when they were busted up, there were some memos back and forth. And they could never get it off the ground. They were always killing it. And they were both responsible for it. So I think the honest answer is the book wouldn't be written. It would still be, that book is the book they would have written together, and they weren't going to write it. So I think it would have just not happened.
Yes, gentleman here.
So there's a line in the book where I think Danny talks about comparing the human being to being an organism that's equipped with like an effective and hormonal system that's similar to a jungle rat, having the ability to kind of push buttons of mass destruction or something very similar to that.
Right.
I'm kind of curious, kind of given the current political climate, what Amos would actually think in terms of his prediction on the election and whether or not he would feel that it was kind of justified based upon the type of irrationality as well as, the set of cognitive biases that are going on.
How he would filter this experience. He would say that he would take great pleasure in people's inability to predict the election. He wouldn't himself have any prediction. Or if he did, he would keep it private and say, I know that this is probably bullshit. But he would say that this is, these people are, they think the future is more knowable than it is. They think the world is a more certain place than it is. Amos is one of his great, lovely line. He said, reality is not a point, it's a cloud of possibilities. And that we're always in a probabilistic situation, even when we don't know it. And we insist on making these seemingly, make it feel like a deterministic situation. To the point where after the fact, when something really, really shocking happens, we go back and tell a story about how it was inevitable. And we explain that which we can't predict with nothing more, no more information other than the outcome. And we do it over and over and over. He left a room like this filled with historians, ashen-faced, by explaining to them what was going on in their minds, in their work, and how there was a huge fallacy at the heart of it. So he would have, first thing he would have done is take great pleasure in how people, he'd have been appalled by Trump, but that's a separate thing. That's not original. He would have then, along with Danny, taken great interest in the way people undid the election, like a tragedy. They were exploring the rules of the imagination with their undoing project when they broke up, and the way people undid something that they didn't like that happened, and the way people were undoing it instantly followed the rules that they had described. They undid the emails. They undid the Comey, the FBI's letter, the director's letter, and the first rule in the undoing project was you start at the end of the causal chain and you work back and you undo the first thing you can undo to undo the outcome, to reverse the outcome, without regard to the probabilities involved. So there was greater than 50% chance that Donald Trump was born a girl, but nobody thinks if only Donald Trump was born a girl. They think if only James Comey had not had not stirred up trouble a week before the election. There are a billion different scenarios in which Donald Trump is not president, but people focus on a couple. And he'd have taken interest in how they do that and what they were doing. And Danny would have been very interested in this too. They would have been, I think, probably really interested in in Trump's appeal. And it's the appeal of all people who are willing to appear confident about things that are unknowable, and certain about things that are unknowable. And he preys actually pretty successfully on these kind of weaknesses in the human mind. People think in stereotypes rather than statistically. So you tell a story about a Mexican immigrant who's murdered somebody, and nobody thinks, oh, what are the stats on that? Are Mexican immigrants actually more likely than anybody else to murder an American? They think, no, they have an image. Muslim terrorists. He's bouncing from stereotype to stereotype. And people do, the point isn't, Amos and Danny's point in the thinking in stereotypes isn't racism, sexism. People actually think in these classifications. You have to resist them. And Trump doesn't resist any of that. So I think they would have had he'd had something to say about that. But I don't think his actual feelings about Trump himself would be that different from a lot of people's.
Question there.
I'm curious, you mentioned that there are a lot of things that have to go right in order for you to write a story. What's the closest you've come to writing a story without actually writing it, and why did you decide to not write it?
I can think of two big cases. One was when I sold Moneyball, I sold it as 2 books, and there was going to be a sequel. And I spent the better part of 3 years chasing around after minor league baseball players, to the point where I was actually in uniform in the AA Midland Rockhounds, shagging fly balls before the game and shouting from instructions from the dugout. And I thought I was going to trace through the kids the Oakland A's had drafted by algorithm what happened with the ideas and the revolution, if there was a revolution. But the problem was Moneyball got so noisy, and there was so much stuff written about it that I just felt it devoured my own story. So I put a huge amount of work into that, and it just came to nothing. So instead of writing the sequel, I ended up writing the prequel, which is what this is in a way. The other one, the one that got away, which violates a bit, what contradicts a bit what I was saying earlier about not being interested in great men, or famous people. George Soros, do you know who he is? Soros, the hedge fund manager, but also in the early 90s, the creator of the Open Society network in Eastern Europe. I spent a couple of weeks with him roaming his empire and writing a magazine piece about it, and he was a book. At that moment, he was a great, great, great book. And he agreed to let me write it, to let me just trail around behind him. And then he read the magazine piece I wrote. And the magazine piece was very flattering about him, but dismissive of his intellectual life. And he has great theories to explain basically his animal instincts, and they just seemed like, I thought they were nonsense. But I quite admired him. And he did not like the way I treated his ideas, and he pulled the plug on it. And that's a great shame. I could have done a lot with him as a subject at that moment in history, and it would have spoken. It would be evergreen. I think that. So I was really sorry to lose that one.
Well, I think there's only one way we can really bring this to a close, and that's to put this test of serendipity. And three people, I give three people a chance in 2 sentences to suggest what the subject of Michael's next book should be.
That's very good.
Anyone like to come up with any ideas as to what?
We have one right here.
We do. Yeah.
Great women.
Women?
Great women.
Great women.
So many references to great men. All the questions were from men. I feel like there's a place for women.
But I don't even write about great men. What I need is little women, right? I mean, women who are obscure and who's in some interesting situation. My publicist from my publisher is right behind you, and she says I'm incapable of writing women accurately. So that maybe it's just beyond me. I can only do, if men are dogs and women are cats. Dogs are easy. They're hungry and they're tired, and that's it. And those are my characters. Really simple characters, simple guys. And women are complicated, and I can't get my mind around them. But I'm with you. If a story opened up that I could put, The Blind Side had a woman at the middle of it. But if another one opened up, I would be biased to doing it. It's just a question of the material being there.
Okay, 2 more suggestions. Yes, there's one there.
In one of your books, I think it was The Big Short, you talk about men on Wall Street and that they have narcissistic personality disorder. And now we have a president that might have narcissistic personality.
This is just a weird dude. I mean, we are talking about. We have not plumbed the depths of his weirdness, and that's so. But
I think that if you really look at that as a mental disorder, and see how it flows through different corporations and how decisions are made, I think that's a really fascinating.
It's a really good topic, but. Who's the character?
Well, I know, because there are lots of them.
Yes.
So, but that would be your job, to find who would be the most fascinating person with narcissistic personality disorder that you could bring through. Right now is probably Trump, but it's, it would be fascinating if you really look at on the spectrum what entails. And then you could almost predict how behavior and decisions are being made.
Huh. All right.
Splendid. Now, one more suggestion. Got one more from this side?
What about Dana White and the UFC and how that came about?
Well, you first have to tell me what it is. The UFC, the fighting, I find that stuff so depressing. I do. People shouldn't be hitting each other in a cage. So it's hard for me to want to draw more attention to it. Yeah.
Well, we're not doing terribly well in coming up with great subjects. No, I think we should. I think, though, what we've learned tonight is why it is that whatever Michael writes, we all, millions of us, enjoy reading it. You're only in New York for a day, I know, Michael, but thank you so much for coming to Stern. It's been absolutely fascinating. And there could be no better Christmas present from all your loved ones, holiday present, than Michael's book, and he will be signing the books at the back afterwards. In the meantime, on your behalf, let's thank Michael very much for coming to Stern.
Thank you.